everyone. This is James Diaz with the Shake a Leg Show. I'm here with Ron Magill, also a Nikon ambassador. And Ron, please introduce yourself. And
Well, listen, first of all, I appreciate the invitation to be here. I'm Ron Magill. I'm the communications director at Zoo Miami, and I've been there now just over 45 years. I started at the old Crandon Park Zoo in Key Biscayne, which was a tiny little zoo on a beautiful piece of property, but it really was kind of a horrific place if you think back on it. You know, the typical cages with bars, concrete floors. So being a part of that whole transition of moving all those animals from Key Biscayne out to South Dade, where we are now, was kind of like a Noah's Ark. So I learned an awful lot, got to work with a lot of different animals. Things have changed so much over the years. For me, I started to work at the zoo not to work for an attraction.
Right.
I'll say something that most people will be a little surprised. I would never ever support taking an animal out of the wild and putting it on exhibit.
Right.
Unless it's the last-ditch effort to save that individual animal's life or to save the species that it represents. And zoos have done that. Zoos have done that with the California condor, the Arabian oryx, the black-footed ferret. These are all species that would be extinct today were it not for zoos saving them. But having said that, I wanted to work for a conservation organization. I don't want to work for an attraction.
Yeah, it's good to do stuff like that. It's good to support that kind of stuff. And so tell us about your childhood. Like, where did you grow up, and how did you get into the animal?
I grew up in a small apartment in New York City. My father was a Cuban immigrant. My mother was the daughter of a Colombian and German immigrant. Didn't have very much. I tell kids all the time, I have the privilege of speaking to kids around South Florida, and they say, gosh, what drove you to do what you do? First of all, I've always loved animals. Animals for me always fascinate me because I'll say something a lot of people don't understand is that as a kid I was bullied quite a bit. I was very, very tall, very skinny, very uncoordinated. I was also, Spanish was my first language. So when I went to school in New York, none of the kids were Hispanic.
Right.
So I'm trying to learn English, and I'm a Hispanic kid, so they call me all kinds of names. I mean, just some terrible names.
Yeah.
Derogatory names that I call Lurch, Frankenstein, because I was so tall that I became very kind of reclusive. I kind of buried myself in the books because that's all I had. I couldn't really relate to the kids much. But I also remember going out to the schoolyard in New York or out by my house in New York, and I remember taking peanuts and feeding a squirrel. And the squirrel would come down and he would eat the peanut out of my hand. Not that I'm advocating you should go out there and feed wild animals. You shouldn't be doing that. But as a kid in New York, that was my connection. Right. And this squirrel came up, and I remember him eating that peanut. And the squirrel didn't judge me. I mean, this sounds kind of really stupid, I know, but as a kid, I had an animal that was sitting there eating the peanut, just kind of like my bud, And the same thing with pigeons. Pigeons would come and they'd fly and they'd land on my hand and they'd eat. And all of a sudden, I had something that was kind of a friend. That was something I related to. I said, animals, if nothing else, they're honest. They're not mean. I try to tell people all the time, you say, well, this animal's a mean animal. There's no such thing as a mean animal. Animals try to protect their territory. They'll try to protect their families. They'll try to get what they can to get their food, but they don't do things out of malice. And that's one of the things I learned as a kid. I'm working with these animals, so I loved animals. Now, kids today, they've got this incredible variety of programming. You've got the Discovery Network, you've got Animal Planet, you've got National Geographic Channel. When I was a kid, you'd have to be real old to remember this. Your dad would probably remember. There was one show. It was on at 7:30 Sunday night, right before The Wonderful World of Disney. It was called Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. And I would watch that show. That was like going to church for me. I'd watch that show. All we had was one television in our house. It was a little black and white, 12-inch black and white television set. Mm-hmm. I'd tell the story over and over again because that's all we had with one of those little extendable, antennas that we broke after the first 2 weeks. So we put a coat hanger in there to get better reception. And I'd watch that show, and I would just dream about going to those places that they had in that show. And there were two co-hosts in that show. There was a guy named Marlon Perkins and another guy named Jim Fowler. And Marlon was the guy who kind of told the story, but Jim was the guy that was really doing the stuff. I mean, I saw Jim jump out of helicopters to put radio collars on elk. I saw him, rappel down mountains to grab a condor with one hand. I saw him catch a jaguar in the Amazon with a throw net. This guy was my hero. He was everything that I wanted to be. And I would tell people, that's what I want to do. I wanted to do that. And people would say, Ryan, you got to come up with plan B because, I'm a kid growing up in a small apartment in New York City, immigrant parents. That's a 1 in a million job. You come up with plan B. Yeah. But my parents always believed in me, and I had some really good teachers that would always encourage me, that always told me, listen, Ron, you're a smart guy. You know, you just gotta stay focused. And I did. And to make a long story short, I will tell you that Jim Fowler, who was my hero, I got to meet him about 38 years ago. He was doing a national tour around the United States promoting Wild Kingdom. And whatever city he flew into, he would call the local zoo to see if they had any ambassador animals that they could bring to his presentation. You know, he didn't want to fly around the country with animals in the plane. It's too stressful on the animals. And I've never been starstruck. I've never really have been starstruck. But when I heard Jim Fowler was coming to town, I said, oh, please, send me. And they did. And I remember going to meet Jim Fowler. It was then at the Jackie Gleason Theater. And I went to his dressing room, had his name on his dressing room. I knocked on the door, he opened the door. And I'm a tall guy, but he's almost as tall as I am, but he's bigger. And he had this great voice. And he went, you must be Ron. Well, to make a long story short, he became my greatest mentor. Other than my dad and my mom, he was my mentor.
Yeah.
He took me under his wing. He taught me how to work with animals. He taught me how to present animals. But most importantly, he taught me how to respect animals. And the biggest lesson he always taught me is that if you learn to properly respect animals, you should never be in a position to be afraid of them. That's something I hold true today.
That's really good advice, because people these days, you know, they'll go hunting and stuff like that, and it's like...
You know, I got to be honest with you, though, James. I've got nothing against the true conservation hunter, because there are hunters who do more for conservation than you would ever imagine. If it was not for the hunting licenses, for the duck stamps, we wouldn't have half of the natural areas that we have. Having said that, hunting for trophies, I'm totally against.
Yeah.
If you're going to go out and you're going to hunt a deer, we've already removed so many of the natural predators. We don't have the wolves. We don't have the cougars. We don't have the animals to keep those deer populations in balance. So if you're going to go out and hunt a deer, now I don't hunt myself, but I have nothing against hunters, because I'd be a hypocrite. If you go out and hunt a deer and you stock your freezer with that venison and you eat that all year long, what makes that any different than me going to Publix and taking a steak out of the meat locker?
Right.
Okay? And the reality is, and I hate to say this, but the reality is, that deer probably died a more humane death than some of the lives of some of the cattle in these cattle farms have to live going through these processing places. So, you know, let's not be a hypocrite here and understand that the true conservation hunter is there to make sure that property is always there, to make sure that land is available for those animals, because he or she wants to make sure that their kids can go out and enjoy nature the way that they did. And, you know, again, now, if you're going to go out and shoot something just to put a head up on the wall, I have no patience for that. Yeah. I have no patience for people out of some kind of machismo want to prove that I was able to kill this. No, that to me is not right. But I also believe that extremism in any form is dangerous. If you're the person that says you should never ever kill an animal, you're not being realistic, because we live that way. It is a circle of life. The only thing I can demand, and I request and require people I speak to, is just let's be humane about it.
Right.
Let's be humane about it, and I think that makes a big difference.
Right.
So, hunters, the true conservation hunter plays a very important role in maintaining natural areas for people to enjoy.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that, because it's like the movie Ace Ventura.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite movies, because I
It's a
like
great
that
movie.
comedy and stuff.
Jim Carrey's a piece of work.
But I mean, in the second movie where he walks into the guy's office with all the animal heads and that scene, it's like I could understand what he was feeling.
Yeah, because these are animals that are being killed as a trophy. I don't understand that.
Yeah.
Now listen, I have a lot of people don't know this, but I have a huge collection of animal skulls. But all of those animals died naturally. And rather than just bury or incinerate them, I save the skulls, because when I go to a school and I go to a bunch of fifth graders and I have them hold the skull of a lion and they can touch the teeth of a lion, they realize, first of all, they're not these razor-sharp teeth that you see on cartoons. You try to dispel some of the myths. You can learn so much by looking at the skull of an animal. And that plants a seed in the kids that makes them want to learn more. They want to be fascinated. Oh my gosh, let me tell you, what are the teeth of a crocodile like? Well, why does this hyena have these big bones along the side, to control all those muscles for the big bite? Look at the size of the molars on the back of a hyena. It's the only animal that can chew through elephant bone. You learn a lot about animals that way. So I collected skulls. I would literally, this is going to sound kind of gross, but my parents would freak out because they'd see like a raccoon hit on the side of the road. I'd go, stop, and I'd get the head and I'd put it in a plastic bag and I'd bring it home, and I had a whole colony of beetles. They're called domestic beetles
Right.
that feed on the dead flesh. And then I would use hydrogen peroxide, and I'd make it nice and white, and I'd glue all the teeth in. It was like putting a model together. But I learned so much by doing that. You know, I learned what kind of teeth they had. I learned the whole structure of the animal, and it made me learn that much more about the animals. So I have a collection of skulls. If you come to my house, you go to one of my offices in my house, you'll see these skulls of all the, and people kind of go, what does this guy have all these heads with these skulls?
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
I use them as teaching tools, and every one of those animals died naturally. They were not killed for their heads.
So another thing I want to get into is this week's topic is planet protectors. It's all
Yes.
about protecting the planet, you know. So what advice can you give to the viewer on how they can pitch in and really protect our animals, the environment?
You know, it's really important that people understand this, and I say this to everybody out there. There's a saying that I believe in very profoundly, and I'll give you an example of how that works. And that saying is, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. We had a situation recently, well, a couple of years now, at Zoo Miami, where they wanted to build a water park
Oh yeah, I heard
in an
about
area
that, yeah.
there that really is critical habitat for several types of wildlife.
Right.
The county, the zoo director, all these people were all, we got to build this thing, because they were being promised money. Okay, you're gonna make all these profits off of the profits of the gate, blah 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 blah. I said, this is wrong. You can't do this.
Right.
I was told, you're forbidden from saying anything about that. And I counted to 10, and I said, well, you know what? You can tell me what I'm forbidden to saying as Ron Magill from Zoo Miami, but you can't tell me what I'm forbidden to saying as Ron Magill, private citizen. And they said, well, that's fine. You know, that won't be a very good career decision. And there was the innuendos of threats
Right.
that, you know, you're going to pay if you do something like that.
Mhm.
Well, at the end of the day, now I'm also going to be honest with you. It's easier for me. I've been at the zoo over 45 years. If they fired me, I'd be okay. You know, I've been able to save for my retirement. So that gives me a little bit more cushion than maybe other people might have had. But I said, forget this. I said, I wrote a letter to the editor. And it was published, and then every news organization called me up and said, we want to interview you. I said, you can, but you're going to have to come to my house after hours, because I didn't want to give the zoo director or the county any reason to, you know, discipline me for insubordination because, well, you did it on zoo time. You can't do that on zoo time. No. Come to my house. Well, they all came to my house. And I want to be honest with you. You know why they did that? The media loves conflict. Okay. So here's this guy who's been the voice of the zoo for decades.
Right.
And now he's speaking against something that the zoo wants to do. So they like that. And I understood that too. I said, okay, let's go. And I flat out put on the news, and then it was all over the news. And I tell you, James, one of the things that really bothered me about that was that there were so many people that were saying exactly what I was saying for a long time, but nobody was listening. We live in a very shallow society. I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that. People see you on television, they hear you on the radio, they think you're important. I'm going to tell you right now, that couldn't be any further from the truth in many occasions. Because it's the people that do the work behind the scenes. You know, whether you're on television, it's the cameraman, it's the writers, it's the producers that are busting their butt. It's not that face on television that deserves all the credit. That person's usually riding the coattails of these people doing all the work behind the scenes. So I would get a lot more credit than I deserved. And I really don't feel comfortable. Sometimes people come up to me and they go, oh my gosh, I love what you're doing at the zoo. I love it. Because I don't do it. I talk about the people that are doing all the work at the zoo now. I used to do that work, so I know how hard it was. But I don't do it anymore. But people think because they see you on television, they do that. Well, the same thing with the media. Now this guy, we know who he is. The community knows who he is. Let's give him the platform. I wish they had given that platform to all the people working behind the scenes who were bringing up the same problems, but nobody was listening. When I went and made that statement about this whole thing, what inspired me more than any words can say was how people came out of the woodwork and saying, we believe the same thing, especially your generation, the youth. You guys have more power than you can ever imagine because you're now young voters, you're young spenders, you set trends. And all these politicians, they're not as much leaders as they are followers. They're looking to see which way the wind is blowing, which way it's going to get them elected.
Right.
Today, I'm not seeing as many politicians as I'd like to doing what they think is right. They're doing a lot of times, well, what's going to get me the furthest? It's very disappointing to me. Having said that, I was pleasantly surprised by our county commission, because when all these kids got behind us and we all went down in the commission chair and everybody was wearing t-shirts and everybody said, we're against this. Now, I know these commissioners had already voted to do it. They'd already signed on a dotted line. And if they were going to now cancel it out, the county was going to get sued. Okay? I know the county was going to get sued because they had a contract. Blah, blah.
Right.
I said, I don't care if the county, this is wrong. I don't want to come here. I would be a hypocrite if I was not to say anything and let this thing happen to this. So the bottom line is, you know, you had these kids from high school, from universities, elementary schools coming, and they were able to convince the commissioners to say, you know what, and the mayor, to her credit, no, we're not going to do this. You know, I've been subpoenaed by the company who wanted to build a water park. They're suing the county now. The county's probably going to have to pay out some money. But at the end of the day, we did the right thing because we preserved this area, and it was validated when after all the decisions were made, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came in and officially declared that entire area as critical habitat. So, you know, listen, it's something every day I drive into work now and I have a smile on my face because I look at this and I say, this is staying this way because we fought hard against all odds and we won it. So that's, in a long roundabout way, the message that I give to the people listening. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. If you believe in something and you know you're doing the right thing, get people together. Coordinate yourselves together. Be one voice. And you'd be surprised how politicians will listen. They need your votes. They can't vote for themselves. All right? They need to, but we can't be afraid. Somebody has to be the first one to step up and say, listen, this is wrong. We can do this. But having said that, we've got to be respectful. You know, you can't have people going to commission chambers and shouting things at the commissioners. You can't be disrespectful. That's not going to get you anywhere. You know, be respectful. Be concise. Don't be afraid to be passionate, but you can be passionate without being disrespectful. And understand that at the end of the day, there's going to have to be some kind of compromise. You know, you can't always get everything you want, and be willing to compromise and keep an open mind. So that's the biggest advice I can give you. And then on the day-to-day stuff, gosh, you know, things that I never thought of as a kid. Things that are like recycling, water conservation, you know, composting, all these types of things that have now become part of our narrative in today's world. That's something that has to be driven by your generation. Because I still see people in my generation doing things like smoking a cigarette and throwing a butt in the street and, you know, throwing things that I can't tell you how many times I go to the beach and I see cigarette butts and trash on the beach. That's got to stop. You know, things like reusable plastics. Why are we still buying bottled water? I mean,
it's insane.
To me, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that is still going on with the amount of plastics and what we've proven of plastics. Listen, I was just on some islands not too long ago, and we found these dead seabirds, and their stomachs, when we opened them up, were just full of plastics. The plastics killed them. The plastics killed them. You know, I've seen a sea turtle with one of those, you know, the rings that you have a six-pack of Coke on around its neck.
Yeah.
I mean, until you've seen something like this, you don't realize how detrimental it can be. So we have to just change our ways as far as consumers go, as far as what we're utilizing, and again, just believe in ourselves to have them, you know, the choice to make a difference.
Yeah, I work at Home Depot, so at least once a week we have to deal with all the garbage and stuff from our departments. But I noticed that, you know, we go through a lot of plastic bottles, especially for the employees, because what we do is we just mark it down and, you know.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's crazy.
Well, and you know what I'm starting to see now, though, but I start to see it a lot better. And again, I'm not trying to patronize your generation, but I see the youth now have their own water bottles. They're refillable water bottles. I see them always in their backpacks or swinging the sling on their shoulder. You know, that's what has to happen. And you're seeing now more in parks, you know, where you have a place to refill your water bottles. Right. It's not just a water fountain, but it's actually a thing that fills water bottles. You're seeing it at the airports and things like that. So it's, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. The culture's changing, but you got to keep your foot on the pedal.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you on that. You know, using plastic is really, it's not safe for the environment. And,
at all.
Yeah, and I see it all the time. Home Depot, I go get lunch, and all I see is like garbage and plastic on the in the bushes and stuff like that in the parking lot. And it's like, why can't we as a society be, protect our environment?
At the
Mr. Disruptive over there.
at the end of the day, it has to do again with getting people to create one voice to make that change. I'll give you a classic example. I just got back from Australia, right?
Right.
In Australia, I was having a Coke. First of all, it's not a big Coke. The Coke cans are smaller. It's more of a single serving Coke. But I was looking at the ingredients of the Coke. You have Coca-Cola here. What's the first ingredient? High fructose corn syrup. Okay.
Don't even know that.
High fructose corn syrup, which a lot of people say is just not the best stuff for you. In Australia, it's cane sugar. They don't use fructose. It's actually been outlawed. They don't use corn syrup anywhere.
Wow, that's interesting.
And ironically, the administration now is trying to change that here too, make it go to cane sugar. But they're going to have a hard time. You know why?
Why?
Because corn is one of the biggest products of the United States. And corn farmers have a huge voice in what they produce. And, there's the threat of, well, you know what? If you stop using high corn fructose syrup, we're going to lose all our jobs. I think there's a compromise. Again, there's two sides to a story, and I think the truth is sometimes always somewhere in the middle. So we got to keep an open mind, but we got to not let money determine every decision we make. Because a lot of the people who are making those decisions already have more money than they need. When you get into something like the coal industry or the petroleum industry, things like this, these are people, the insurance industry, listen, I could go on and on about how it's lopsided and who's making the money and who's not getting the money.
Right.
So we just have to be a little bit more equal in the way we distribute who benefits from what.
Yeah, and that's you hit it right on the nail. Now let's get into your photography life.
Well, I'll tell you,
Tell us about that.
for me, photography became a necessity, and I don't know how familiar everybody is who listens to you, who you are, but your dad is one of the greatest photographers I've ever worked with.
Thank you.
And he is one of my greatest mentors. As a zookeeper starting at the zoo 40-something years ago, I would watch the Miami Herald photographers come. And I'd watch them take pictures, and I'd watch how they look at different perspectives. And those photographers, the iconic photographers of your dad's class, were great teachers. Today, I see a big difference. I see a lot of these photographers, when you ask, oh, you wouldn't know. Everybody wants to keep their own little secrets. It's all a competition. Back in those days when we started, everybody wanted to share things. How do you learn different things? Your dad was one of my greatest mentors. On my day offs, I would shadow him. He would take me to all kinds of stories. He'd take me to the Dolphin games. I'd be on the sidelines with him and I watched the way he worked. And I said, my God, this guy's incredible the way he works. And I needed to do that because what I was doing as a zoologist, I was writing these stories and providing them to magazines for publication. And they said, oh, great story, but we need some pictures to go with it. So then I'd call the stock agencies, Getty or people like that. I said, listen, I need a picture of a cheetah chasing a Thompson gazelle. Oh, here it is. Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, let me have that. How much is that going to cost? They told me, and I went, what? I can't afford that. I'm a zookeeper. And I said to myself, you know what? I'm just going to buy a camera. I'll teach myself how to take pictures. And what I did was I started, purchasing the magazines like Popular Photography, Shutterbug, all those magazines, because they would have little tutorials in it. And they'd always have these contests in the beginning, your best shot, where you enter, for $250 if you win the best shot. And I would look at these winners all the time, and I would say, some of them were great. Some of them, well, that's a great shot. And then some of them would say, well, that's not so good. I mean, I could do that. And I thought to myself, if I could do that, it's not that good. Okay. What it taught me was, first of all, photography is very subjective.
Right.
There is one person who might look at your photograph and say, oh my God, it's the greatest thing. And another person will look at it and go, that sucks. People, it's interpreted different ways. What your dad taught me was patience, be at the right place at the right time, and most importantly, the biggest advantage I have as a wildlife photographer is know your models. Okay, know the behavior of what your models are going to do. So he taught me that. Your dad is a master of knowing athletics, sports. He gets those shots because he knows how a play is going to run. He knows what play is probably coming up next, whether it's going to be a pass, whether it's going to be a run. He knows where to position himself for a receiver or a running back. he gets those shots because he knows his models. Okay.
Right. It's
but
also known as, he says, visualizing the moment.
exactly. He
Yeah.
visualizes ahead of time. He knows how to
Right.
predict a moment
Right.
and be in the right place. So that's one of the greatest, I think, traits a photographer has to have is patience. You have to have infinite patience to wait for that right moment, but be ready for it. You know, and so that's what I did. And then I started winning some of these contests. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm starting to win. And then I won a big contest with Nikon. I won one of their international contests, and it provided me with thousands of dollars worth of equipment as a prize. And I was like, oh, wow. And that got it started.
Hard work pays off.
Yeah, and you know, and then I just started. I am not by any stretch of the imagination the brightest bulb in the chandelier. There's not many things that I can do well, but I think I'm a decent storyteller.
Right.
When I'm telling stories about things that I'm passionate about, there's no greater tool I have in my toolbox to tell a story than my camera. Because I can't take people with me when I'm in the middle of the Amazon, or I'm in the middle of the Kalahari, or I'm in the middle of, you know, Antarctica. But if I can capture that in good images, I can use those images to tell that story and get people engaged, get them immersed. So photography has been the most important tool I've ever had in getting people to care about animals. There's an old saying that says, in the end, you protect what you love what you understand, and you understand what you're taught. Photography has been the greatest tool I've had to teach people to understand animals and hopefully love them a little bit more.
That's great. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Think Tank Photo, for sponsoring this video.
Yes, and thank you for the gear that I use of Think Tank Photo. It's the best gear I can ever imagine. That's all I use when I travel around the country with my camera gear. Think Tank is the best.
And with that, we'd like to conclude this episode of the Shake Leg Show. Please stay tuned for next week's episode. Bye.
Take care.